and welcome to your lecture on democracy and the golden age of Athens. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. If I have seen further, wrote Sir Isaac Newton in 1675 AD, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Many of the giants upon whose mighty shoulders Western civilization stands are carved of Grecian marble. We learned how to think from the Greek philosophers. We learned the importance of trial by jury from Greek lawmakers. We learned the Pythagorean theorem from Greek mathematicians. We learned the Hippocratic Oath from Greek doctors. The columns in our buildings and the roots of many of our words are Greek. And yet, of all the Grecian giants that support our civilization, perhaps none is so important as democracy. Democracy is a system of government where citizens, that is, official members of a country, play an active role in government and run it either directly or through representatives, which are people chosen to act on the public's behalf. The United States is a representative democracy. Citizens don't make laws themselves. Instead, they vote to elect representatives to make the laws for them. Athens, on the other hand, was a direct democracy. Every citizen had the right and the responsibility to create, argue for or against, and vote on laws and governmental decisions. Although the roots of Athenian democracy stretch back at least to the 6th century BC, it was really during the period between 460 and 320 BC that Athens created and implemented the world's first democracy. It was the first time in history that ordinary citizens had a say in how their government was run. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule. Here you see democracy handing the crown of power to the ordinary Athenian citizen. Athenian democracy was set up to protect the power of the people, and all adult male citizens were expected to participate. We alone, wrote Thucydides, the Greek historian, regard the man who does not partake in politics not as unambitious, but as useless. In other words, you have a responsibility to help run your government. And if you're not willing to shoulder that responsibility, you are a waste of space. But there weren't that many wastes of space in Athens. For the most part, Athenians valued their freedom, they loved their democracy, and they were eager to participate. After all, where else in the world did every male citizen, regardless of background, have an equal say? It didn't matter if you were rich or poor or what your job was. Your opinion mattered. You had the right to speak at the public assembly. You had the right to vote on the decisions and laws that would govern your city and your life. You will notice, however, that throughout this lecture, I've used the word male an awful lot. That is because only male Athenian citizens were allowed to participate in Athenian democracy. Women, slaves, foreigners, and children had no political rights. All in all, the voting population of Athens was about 10 to 20% of the whole. And when we look at that from a modern perspective, that percent seems awfully small. Only 10 to 20% of the people in your city could vote. That's pretty undemocratic, right? Well, remember, this is the first time in history that a country has tried out democracy. Before this, power has always been in the hands of exactly one person, the king, or at most in the hands of an elite few. And we're going from that to 20% of the population, ordinary citizens, even illiterate farmers, are allowed to have a say in how their government is run. That is groundbreaking. However, despite their emphasis on citizen control of the political process, Athenians did realize that they needed some individuals in positions of political power. They needed generals to command their armies. They needed political officials to help organize affairs and make sure that public meetings ran smoothly. But they wanted to make sure that these people in positions of political power did not have so much power that they could then take over the government. So they decided to make their generals elected officials. You would vote for who you wanted to be general of the army. And Other political officials were chosen by lot. In other words, when it came time to choose public officials, the names of Athenian citizens would be basically pulled out of a hat, and if your name was chosen, congratulations, you're going to be a political official for a year. Despite having generals commanding the armies and public officials running affairs, most decisions were still made by the ecclesia, the public assembly, where an average of about 6,000 ordinary citizens would gather to discuss and vote on important policy matters and laws. The Athenians weren't always thinking about politics, however. They were philosophers, artists, and playwrights, and they had the perfect opportunity to practice those skills during the Golden Age of Athens. The Golden Age of Athens, which lasted from 479 to 431 BC, was the peaceful, prosperous period following the Persian Wars, when Athens rebuilt herself and created some of the most famous artistic and cultural works of the ancient world. Greek architecture is instantly recognizable, in large part because it's so admired that other civilizations, like the Romans in the past, like us today, use it for their most important buildings. See, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States. Famous Greek buildings are often marble and colonnaded. Since straight columns don't look straight from afar, Greek architects subtly thickened or tilted columns in order to create the illusion of straightness. They did this so masterfully that up close, the columns still look straight. One of the most famous examples of Greek architecture is the Acropolis, the city atop a hill in Athens that was rebuilt after King Xerxes destroyed it during the Greco-Persian Wars. Here's what it looks like today. Here is what it might have looked like during the Golden Age of Athens. Within the Acropolis was the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, and the patron goddess of Athens. The Parthenon is one of the most striking examples of Greek architecture. It's a pretty marvelous sight even today, but here's what it might have looked like once upon a time. Isn't it gorgeous? You actually still can experience the Parthenon as it might have been, or at least a copy of it, if you go not to Athens, but to Nashville, Tennessee. Within the Parthenon was a stunning gold-plated statue of Athena. The Greeks were so talented at sculpture that the Roman poet Virgil wrote that they could lead living faces from the marble. In other words, their statues were so lifelike that they really seemed alive. Nowadays, it's so common for statues to look lifelike that we think nothing of it. But that's because we learned sculpture from the Greeks. If you look at the statues from other ancient civilizations, they often don't look very lifelike at all. Take a look at this statue of Ramses the Great from Egypt, for example. It's a well-carved, powerful statue. But Ramses the Great here doesn't really look human, does he? He's standing a little bit too stiffly. You would never mistake him for a real person. Compare that to this Greek statue of a dying warrior. Anguish and exhaustion are written in every line of his body as he struggles to hoist himself up. Compare it again to this statue of two wrestlers who look not so much like figures in stone, but like people frozen in time. If they were to start moving all of a sudden, you probably wouldn't be that surprised. You may have noticed, both with this statue and the preceding one, that the figures aren't wearing much in the way of clothing. That's because the Greeks were always striving for perfection in their art, and they wanted to display the human form in all of its beauty. That meant no t-shirts allowed. Greek statues are usually fully or partially naked. When they weren't debating politics, designing columns, or leading living faces from marble, the Greeks liked to go to the theater. Theater may in fact have been first created in Greece. Although plays were originally religious in nature, they developed until they ranged from comedies mocking modern-day life to retold myths that explored profound themes like the nature of justice. Admission was free, and theater was so popular that there were playwriting contests where plays from the top playwrights would be performed back to back. Prizes and fame awaited the writer of the best play. All good times must come to an end, however, and for Athens, their golden age ended with the beginning of a war that would rip Greece apart. Join me next week as we discuss the Peloponnesian Wars. See you next week.